This is a revision video for capital punishment, particularly focusing on Christian attitudes for the different examination boards. Now behind me is a map of the world, and you'll notice it's colour-coded. Those countries in blue are those which no longer use capital punishment, for example, Australia and Britain. Those in kind of greeny yellow colour are those which no longer use capital punishment except in exceptional circumstances, for example, in time of war. So Brazil springs to mind there. Those in orange have not used capital punishment for the last 10 years, and so are seen as abolitionist in practice. In other words, they're unlikely to use it again, and within a few years they may be those which become the blue countries. And finally those in red, countries which still use capital punishment, China and the United States being key there. Now, the first question is why? What kinds of things will cause someone to be put forward for the death penalty? Premeditated murder, treason, terrorism, rape and kidnapping have all been crimes which could have seen somebody put for the death penalty. However, in most countries now, premeditated murder is the prime candidate, so to speak. There are several different methods used across the world. However, these are the ones which are more likely to be used. There are more medieval methods which are less used now. Hanging has gone out of fashion, but particularly in the 1950s and before was most popular. Lethal injection is the one used in the United States now. Stoning, still around, particularly in the Arabic nations. There was a newspaper report recently of a woman who was sentenced to be stoned to death. Firing squad is much more for the military, and again is less commonly used. An electric chair, many people think about, although is hardly used anymore, is one which was used much more in the 1800s, pre-World War I, however, is not used very much now. Now, some people will argue that capital punishment should be brought back, and they'll use a number of reasons, one of which is protection. In other words, society is protected from a killer or a criminal, because in death you cannot commit another crime. We have deterrence. Deterrence is about putting someone off doing a crime. If you know you will be killed for doing your crime, you are less likely to do it. So the argument goes. Retribution is about getting revenge. Now, there are two sides to that. One, about society enacting its own revenge against someone who has committed a crime, but also perhaps this feeling of retribution from the family. They feel they've got their own back for someone who's killed a loved one. Finally, the cost. Keeping a prisoner in bed and board in a prison, very expensive, can run into the millions if they were to be put in a life sentence. Capital punishment, arguably, is a cheaper option. Now, the Old Testament lists a number of crimes, and particularly, a phrase to remember is eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, life for a life. However, there are a number of crimes listed in Leviticus which would have you executed. And according to Leviticus, these celebrities may have been executed. The crime of homosexuality was one. Being a medium, a fortune teller, or a magician was another crime listed as being punishable by death. Being a stubborn child and going against your father's wishes may also have earned you the death penalty. And finally, worshipping false gods. In other words, if you broke the 10 Commandments, generally you could be up for execution. Now, many people argue against the death penalty. On one argument is the moral argument. In other words, do we become as bad as the criminal if we are killing other people? Do we set a good example? Do we turn round and kill people to show that killing people is wrong? Perhaps a little bit hypocritical there. Secondly, a chance of reformation. Does the criminal get a chance to change? A second chance at society, a second chance at life. If they're dead? No. Mistakes, miscarriages of justice. What can we do about people who perhaps are not able to be 100% convicted of their crime? Is it fair to kill them, to execute them, even though there may be some movement of doubt? Even with latest DNA evidence, not every crime can be 100% certain. And finally, the emotional turmoil. One, for those on death row, it can take many years, in some cases decades, to be put through the execution. Secondly, for the prisoner's family, they have to see their loved one going through that issue. And finally, for the family of the victim, they have to deal with all of the extra court cases, the appeals, and things like that. Christian attitude, particularly to go with the against side can be summed up in this story. The woman caught in adultery. The woman in the centre was caught in adultery, in other words, cheating. She was brought to Jesus by the priests and asked what he would do about this situation, intended perhaps to trick him into going against Jewish law. Jesus' response was, let he who has cast the first, let he who has not sinned cast the first stone. In other words, if you've done nothing wrong, you can therefore judge her. As a result, many of the crowd that had brought her to see Jesus walked away, realising that they were not perfect. Eventually, there was no one left except Jesus and the woman, to which he turned around and said, if no one has judged you, then neither will I. And this gives the idea that perhaps we should be giving people a second chance, that chance for reformation.